everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Zach Schlossberg. I oversee programming at the Joins Reading Room in Carruthers Hall on behalf of the Plan 2 Honors Program. You might have noticed, though, that this is not the Joins Reading Room. And it's true that on very special occasions, we extend ourselves into this beautiful space thanks to the hospitality of the Harry Ransom Center. And tonight, hosting Carl Phillips qualifies as just such a special occasion. One that wouldn't be anywhere close to happening without the incredible generosity of our partners at the Michener Center for Writers and the additional support of Plan 2's Glickman Lectureship. So thank you to Brett, Holly, and everyone over at the Michener Center, as well as Grace and the entire HRC team, and of course Amber, Elsie, Dr. Wetlaufer, and the Plan 2 office. And lastly, before I get into intros, if you've never been to the Joins Reading Room over in Carruthers Hall, I encourage you to check out our slate of literary programming throughout the academic year. Our next event is on Tuesday, April 1st in 1 week with the visionary painter and writer Riva Lair. Now, I will say a few personal words about Carl and then kind of mop up what I've said with actual intros of Carl and Jennifer, who will be in conversation with Carl after Carl gives a reading. So just so you know the flow of the evening. Over his entire body of work, Carl Phillips has endeavored to make something private about the self clear in poetry. Not unprivate, just clear. How to reveal what's hidden and keep it hidden is one of the questions toward which his fantastically sinuous syntax addresses itself. Holiness, Phillips has written, has only two requirements: to be hidden, to adore what's hidden. I think of Mary Ruefle's joke as we stand on the eve of National Poetry Month, April, that the existence of such a month is a betrayal of the best-kept secret of all, poetry. By pushing his sentences far beyond their breaking points, recklessly attempting to gather and say everything, Phillips actually preserves what's secret, unsayable, lurking behind the system of language itself. Some abstractions have names, but not images. His words are like shadows variously darkening an immutable terrain, or the wind, which is visible only as the difference it makes. Not so much his mouth moving, writes Phillips, more the words themselves sort of staggering around, lost inside it. Does poetry rescue private life, or compromise it, smudge it? Maybe privacy doesn't need to be rescued by the truth. It sure feels like it does, though. For now, we have Phillips's poetry, which at least rescues the rest of us. Carl Phillips is the author of 17 books of poetry, most recently Scattered Snows to the North, and then The War, which won the 2023 Pulitzer Prize. His other honors include the 2021 Jackson Prize, the Aiken Taylor Award for Modern American Poetry, the Kingsley Tufts Award, a Lambda Literary Award, as well as many other distinguished honors and fellowships. And Jennifer Elise Foerster is the author of 3 books of poetry, The Maybe Bird, Bright Raft in the Afterweather, an utterly incredible book, and Leaving Tulsa. She is the recipient of an NEA Creative Writing Fellowship, a Landon Foundation Writing Residency, and was a Robert Frost Fellow in Poetry at the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and a Wallace Stegner Fellow in Poetry at Stanford University. And now, without further ado, Carl Phillips.
I know I brought like a whole bunch of stuff. Sorry. Thank you very much, Zach, for that very moving introduction, and for squiring me around and all that. Thank you to the Michener Center and Harry Ransom Center, and everyone involved in both those places, and Jennifer for having a convo with me, and Brett, and everyone I've met, who maybe I forgot, I'm sorry, and all the great students I met yesterday in the Missioner Center. So, okay, I'm very happy to be here, though clearly scared. And I'm gonna read poems, and then we're gonna have a conversation. I'm gonna start, and they're all gonna be from this book, Scatter Snows. It should be pretty brief. I was talking to the students yesterday about readings that go on too long, so I don't want to be one of those people. So I'm going to put the little clock on. So I know. All right. This poem is called Regime. Is this good for sound? Oh, thanks, Doug, in the sound booth, by the way. Regime. As I took off my clothes, I watched him taking his own off. The sound of rain was, for once, not the sound of wind shaking the rain steadily loose from a stand of river birch. It's hard to believe in them, the beautiful colors of extinction. But these are the colors. Before all of this. And as usual, early summer seems already to hold inside it the split fruit of late fall, those afternoons whose diminished music will soon enough lie down in, surprised a little, to feel it all surprised. Meanwhile, how the wind sometimes makes the slenderest trees, still young, bend over, makes me think of knowledge conquering superstition. I can almost believe in that until the trees, like fear, spring back. Then a sad sort of quiet just after, as between two people who have finally realized they've stopped regretting the same things. It's like they've never known each other. Yet even now, waking, they insist they've woken from a dream they share, forgetting all over again that every dream is private. Whatever the reasons are for the dead underbranches of the trees that flourish here, that the dead persist is enough. For me, it's enough. The air stirs like history, like the future, like history. Okay, I've just realized one other reason I brought this bag up. Hold on. Hold on. So I can see. I was thinking, what is happening? I only started wearing them when I read, like 6 months ago. I've had these glasses forever, and one day my partner said, because I said, it's weird, like the words are just moving around. He said, do you wear your glasses? So okay, much better. All right, this poem is called Fall Colors. I've been looking hard at all my friendships, all of them together, and each on its own. And although they feel real enough, from what I can tell on both sides, I understand now that what they have in common is a lack of warmth and compassion. Who can say at this point why that is, or how it matters now, if it does? I say I understand it, but it's more true to say I've come to understand it, having had it pointed out to me, for no reason that I remember, by the only man I think I've ever loved absolutely, and still do. That's a separate thing, like my fear of fire, or like how much of my time I spend pretending I'm not afraid, negotiating this life with all the seeming casualness with which a man whose business involves the handling of fires daily handles a fire. Some days it works. I almost believe myself, or more exactly, and more disturbingly, if I really think about it, don't think about it. I almost believe in the self that's just an imitation of a self I want others to believe in enough for me eventually to believe it too. Believing in versus believing. The trumpet vine that grows up the ginkgo's trunk and has even reached its branches is an example of instinct, not affection. Twice a day, instead of walking, I take my dog for what I call a ramble, where each corner we turn feels like a turning as well of imagination. The sun's behind us now. Its heat on this cold November afternoon that'll soon join all the rest whose details I've forgotten seems a small encouragement, all that's needed most times. I stop, the dog stops, our shadows too. They bloom our shadows north-northeast in front of us. I think that's the longest poem. Just, I like to know when I'm in the audience, like, what am I up against? That's the longest poem, so they'll all be shorter than that. Thicket. Some memories stay, like fallen throwing stars left to lie there. Most disappear, whatever distinguished them rubbed smooth by dailiness, glass into sea glass from the sea's tumbling. Like looking violence for once straight in the face and watching it turn, if not gentler, then differently violent, and telling yourself that's not nothing at least, and calling it eros. But violence has no face. That's just words into pictures again. And eros, please. You can make the stars spell out anything if you stare long and hard enough. What part of didn't you wish for this aren't you getting, for example? Or, it's a quiet night. Quiet, the way the animals here, east of touch, but slightly north still of penetration, live mostly quiet. Most disappear. This is the title poem of this book. It's called Scattered Snows to the North. A title that I thought was innocent enough, but someone recently was telling me how my titles are all gay. And like, I didn't ask them this, they just told me. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, like that comma, Scattered Snows, comma, to the north. That's gay. So now every time I see the poem, I think, huh, interesting. Scattered snows to the north. Does it matter that the Roman Empire was still early in its slow unwinding into never again? Then, as now, didn't people burst into tears in front of other people or in private for no reason that they were willing to give, or they weren't yet able to, or for just no reason? I've never stopped missing you, I used to practice saying, for when I'd need those lines, as I assumed I would, given what I knew then, nothing really, about things like love, trust, the betrayal of trust, and a willfulness that's only deepened inside me all these years, during which I can almost say I've missed no one, though it hurts to say it. Honestly, the Roman Empire, despite my once having studied it, barely makes any sense to me now, past the back and forthing of patrolled borders as the gauge and proof of hunger's addictive and erosive powers. But there were people, of course, too, most of them destined to be unremembered, who filled in their drawn lives anyway, because what else is there, to where the edges gave out. If it was night, they lit fires, presumably. Tears were tears. like so. From attention to adoration is a smallish distance, and yet no arrow, no boat with sail can cross it like the mind's insistence. We'd reached the marshes by then that all the dead must come to. I could see my face tilted there like a solar eclipse viewed indirectly, which is the proper way in a basin of water. You must hold it steady, keep the basin safe from the wind's reach, its competing powers of revelation and distortion. Oh, on a very different note, surfers, a fascination of mine. Surfers, not surfing. Surfers. Probably this morning's surfers aren't that much different from the ones I used to watch nearly 50 years ago, whose glamour seemed so much more fixed, more absolute from a distance than when they got too close, which is the fault not of myth, but of turning people into myth. I was a kid then, and they were more or less men. Soon they'd be men for real, meaning more or less boys. They rarely smiled at me. They never touched me. They mostly pretended not to notice me, though one time, watching them from where I'd hidden in a stretch of dune grass, I could see a couple of them with hands raised to their eyes, scanning the dunes as if searching, and I stood up, unhid myself, and I could tell they'd missed me. Toward nightfall, I'm a lighthouse, I'd sing to myself, but very softly, because boys aren't lighthouses. That's nonsense. Repeat after me. I could never have guessed at it back then, this second life. It was all I could do just to be patient as they paddled their boards out again into the waves. Then they'd catch one, and flashing my arms, extended in front of me like the twin beams of light that softly they'd always been also, I'd guide the men in, to shore, then closer, as if there were a choice that summer, or ever, and I'd chosen, and I could almost still see it from here. All right, I think it's all working out timing-wise. This poem is pretty brief. It's called Western Edge. I need you the way astonishment, which is really just the disruption of routine, requires routine. Isn't there a shock, though, a thrill, to having done what we had to? Unequally, but in earnest, we love as we can, he used to mumble. Not so much his mouth moving, more the words themselves sort of staggering around lost inside it. Now, show me exactly what you think being brave is. I don't know what being brave is, so that's why the poem just ends there. This is called Stop Shaking. Not the bell, I said. One of us did. Not the bell, but the smaller sounds, barely noticeable, trapped inside it. It seemed the kind of thing I might say to remind myself, when I've forgotten again, what I want to believe even now matters most. Precision, though it's hard these days to know for sure what's true. Isn't every season, no matter what we call it, shadow season? Didn't Timothy used to mean a meadow, a common name, back then at least, for the sweetest grass? I keep making the same avoidable few mistakes that I've always made, and then regretting them less. Think of all the suffering happening everywhere, all the time, for nothing. What if memories, just the dead, flourishing differently from how they flourished alive? All right, we have 3 poems. I like to know that too when I'm in the audience. And I'll just say I will never do a thing that I've had happen to me many times. I've been in an audience and someone says, well, I just have 2 or 3 more poems. First of all, they think that equals 5. But then they'll say, and the last 2 are like in 14 parts. It's like, what? Terrible, terribly rude of them. Okay, this is called Fist and Palm. Fist and Palm. There are plenty who'd hardly recognize me now. I used to be that cruel, by which I mean I was frightened mostly, and now I'm mostly not. Joy, if only flickeringly, each day astounds me. The man I used to be dismounts, relents for a bit, before digging his boots, streaked with longing, my own longing, what I can't help, hard into my sides again, into the man I've become. His way of reminding me we've only stopped for rest, a short rest, some water. We've years to go still. He has his job. I have mine. Speechlessness is not an option, he whispers into my ear. He spits on the words themselves after, as if to make them stay, or just to make sure I'm listening. But I'm always listening, as I always obey. Isn't this obedience, these songs I've built from things too difficult to speak of? People ask where I get my titles from, sometimes from texting while driving through a blizzard. That's where I got this title. Back Soon, Driving. The way the present cuts into history, or how the future can look at first like the past sweeping through. There are blizzards, and there are blizzards. Some contain us. Some we carry within us until they die when we do. The snow falls there, barely snowing, into a long wooden trough where the cattle feed on those apples we used to call medieval, or I did, for their smallish size, as if medieval meant the world in miniature, but not so different otherwise from our own, just smaller, a bit sweeter, more prone to rot, therefore to rot quickly, which is maybe not the worst thing. Revelation is not disclosure. I love how the snow, taking itself now more seriously, makes the cattle look softer for a moment than their hard bodies are. But I do not recommend texting while driving, let alone in a blizzard. But sometimes we do what we must. All right, so I'm going to end with this poem called Rehearsal, and then we're going to have a delightful conversation. I'm told it'll be delightful. Rehearsal. By then, the point of the forest was the getting through it. Then it lay behind them, all but its sharper details, flies licking at dried blood, I think, on a random tree stump, getting swiftly lost. Its muffled bird song, too, that had come less, it seemed, from the trees than from beneath mostly, as if somewhere deep, deep inside the earth. Maybe meeting you has been the one good reason I lasted so long in a world that must eventually not include me, I almost said to him. Past the forest, the shore, where the land ended, where briefly the waves hitting it seemed the latest example of how squandering momentum can become routine, while upon the waves, the taken-for-grantedness of shadow play seemed its own example, how one way to prove power can be to quietly assume it. Then, except for offshore, where the dark lay like defiantly a ship at anchor, everything was itself, as it always had been. They took off their shoes, their clothes. They swam out to the dark ship. Thanks so much. I was thinking it got dark. Was it me? There we go.
Yeah, my bag.
Okay, good.
Right.
I was going to detangle myself.
I better put that on.
Oh, sure. It went by kind of quickly, but that, to me, is the best kind of poetry reading when it goes.
Oh, I'm going to ask you to read some more.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. First, I'll put this on.
I've
See if it
never,
works.
I've never had this happen with a dog on the stage. This is amazing.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, I
Well,
love it.
this is Sophie, and you met her before.
I did, yes.
She's doing well. I was telling Carl, there's and some of you know who are in my class. There's one part of her service dog training that she's still working on. She keeps failing this part of the test, and that is barking at closed doors. But otherwise, she's pretty chill. And she wanted to be here with you.
I need one of those.
Because...
Like that setup with the bed and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
it's nice.
is this working okay?
Oh, yeah. Should we be doing something? Oh,
Okay, let's hope for the best.
I think Doug's telling us to stop messing with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is actually a cat litter box.
Oh.
A travel cat litter box.
Oh,
yeah.
cool.
So, and I have a cat at home who's in San Francisco who's about the same size.
Huh.
So she, she does her cat and her dog
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. Nice.
But she knows you love dogs.
I do. I do love dogs.
And you have a dog at home
I
right now.
do indeed have a dog at home.
What's your dog's name?
Emily, but not after Emily Dickinson, though everyone thinks that. So she's just,
Oh.
she was a stray that was found by a woman apparently who was named Emily, and so when that person took her to a shelter, she was given the name Emily.
Oh, I did think it was from Emily Dickinson.
Right, people
What a
think
projection.
that. Well, I just feel like, well, that would be too easy,
Yeah.
for me to do that.
I know, I was thinking that all this
And I would, if I were doing that, I would name the dog Wyatt or something. Have to be a little more obscure.
Wyatt Earp. Well, I met you once some years ago at the Rainier Writing Program.
Yeah.
In 2019. But before that, I knew of you mostly through friends of mine who were your students, or who had some point been a student of yours somewhere, and just spoke so highly of you as a teacher. So I knew you as an amazing teacher before I met you when you came to a program and did some teaching for us. And you're retired now,
Yeah.
I understand, just
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah. Should I be saying more?
No.
Okay.
Because I'm getting to my question.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted to ask what you loved about teaching, probably many things, but what was one of the things that you loved that you might miss?
That's a good question. I never know how, should we act like we're in a living room and no one's
I
out
know.
there? Or do we talk like this as if,
I'm going to
we're
just
talking
move
to
a
ghosts in the living
little
room?
bit towards you. Okay.
I don't know. I think my favorite part of teaching was, it sounds like what everyone would say, but discovering and learning. So, sure, it is nice to bring something to somebody and they've never heard of an author or some information, and now they know it. That's great. But I think the most rewarding was when I would bring something that I was so familiar with, and then seeing how things I'd missed, or just there are whole other different angles I'd never considered. And that, to me, was exciting. And I used to feel, when I first started teaching, I thought, I thought being a good teacher was knowing everything. And then I thought, it's the best thing you can say sometimes is, I don't know. and but also that the adventure is in growing with the students. So that's how I felt about it. It was a little different when I taught high school Latin for 8 years before I did this poetry thing, and that was a little different and more parental because I was the only Latin teacher, and I'd have the same kids for 4 years, and in that very crucial 4 years of their lives. And so that was a different kind of, I felt like, oh, this must be the part that's great about parenting. And then I wouldn't have to see the other parts, but to watch them learn, like to come into a new language, and, but also there I was more like a model of one way to be an adult in the world. And whereas I don't usually find graduate students, maybe they need models, but they don't need to be told or want to be told how to be an adult.
Mm-hmm. What was it that brought you into teaching Latin? Because you studied Latin and Greek in college.
Yeah, I did.
What led you to that?
Well, I was supposed to be a veterinarian. That was my goal all my growing up, childhood. And even intern in a vet's office on surgery days.
Oh, wow.
I want to make sure that I could handle blood.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, I was taking high school Latin. And when I went to college, my plan was to major in biochemistry and be a vet. And my Latin teachers made me promise that in freshman year I would take just a baby Greek course. They said, just try it, ancient Greek. So I did that. And then I feel like this has happened to many a person, but I was telling the Michener students yesterday, one evening I burst into tears over an organic chemistry problem set. And I don't know, I couldn't solve it. And I had this illumination where I thought, the only thing I'm enjoying is this actually very hard class in ancient Greek, but that's the only thing that I feel like is worthwhile. And I made this decision. I would just get a dog and not have to be a veterinarian. And it's all worked out. And I have a dog. I'm not a veterinarian. And I'm happy. And I'm not crying. I mean, I cry routinely, but not over organic chemistry stuff. So.
Yeah. I was going to ask if the chemistry and the biology of the veterinarian training seeped into the Latin and Greek.
No. It
Not
went
at
out
all.
the window, and good riddance to it. I was so glad to be done with that.
I loved the poem that you read, The Fall Colors. And I have all these questions that I wrote out, but I'm just, I'm going to flow around.
Sure, yeah.
But one thing I love about that poem is how it begins with this kind of revelation question of, and I think it's called One Fall Flowers. Yeah, that my friends have not been like compassionate.
Or that I haven't either.
Yeah. And then it goes from that kind of statement of revelation to away from revelation into this beautiful walk with your dog, where you kind of turn just to explore, just kind of to smell, the instinct.
Yeah.
And you bring instinct and imagination and compassion, all these big themes together at the end of the poem with this image of the shadow blooming in front of you and the dog. And I love that poem for so many reasons, but part of it is that at that end, there's something shared between you and the dog are sharing this shadow.
Yeah.
And perhaps, but you as the writer of that poem are acknowledging kind of the imagination in that shadow, but also the way that the shadow doesn't necessarily answer anything to the revelation or the question that you started off with. And I found that, I just think that those themes throughout your poems of having a kind of moral question and then pushing into the question and then kind of finding the kind of resolution in that shadow is really stunning. But when I read that poem, I thought, do you feel like the dog, or you write a lot about dogs in your poems, do you feel like there's a shared experience of that shadow, of that imaginary moment?
Yeah, with the dog?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I do, but I know it's not realistic, probably. But I feel like it's weird because this book, I almost had it dedicated to, it doesn't have person it's dedicated to, but I almost dedicated it to my dog who died, had to be put down shortly before I turned in this manuscript. And because so many of my poems come from my interaction with dogs and doing things like going on these walks and everything. And, but I also feel it does tie in a bit with this whole idea. First of all, I never thought that my friendships lacked compassion. My partner one day out of the blue, after overhearing me talking to a friend on the phone, and then once I hung up, he said, you know, compassion doesn't seem to be a thing with you and your friends. Like, you don't seem to have compassion between you. And I thought, really? I thought that was my best friend on the phone.
Yeah.
But he said, yeah, but she doesn't feel it and you don't feel it, and the way you talk to each other. And so, but I thought, well, maybe I do have, I don't know. I grew up on Air Force bases, moving around all the time, and I feel like that either makes people highly social and capable, or it makes people very much try to hide, like, find a small portable world they can have that is reliable. And I was saying to the students yesterday that for me, in some ways, writing was that way when I was a kid and reading. But I do feel like there's a steadiness to animals that, you know, maybe because they don't have the kind of self-consciousness we do. So they don't, as I understand it, they don't wake up and think, is today it? How do I feel about mortality? They don't think that. You know, they just kind of get up. They might sense one day that, oh, it's time to lie down and maybe, you know, rest or something. But so there's a freedom from all that and not having, and maybe it helps that they don't speak. So, you know, of course, we can then project all of our own stuff on them. And I know that's a big part of what is comforting. You know, the dog understands me, you know, even though the dog probably has no idea about me in certain ways. So
I guess that gets into like the question of imagination.
Yeah.
And the link between, like, is imagination something that is particularly human? And how does that, and
I think it is.
Yeah. And how close is that connected to language? Language is not something that's particularly human. We have a human language that is different from a tree language.
Right. I feel like everything has its own language, but yeah, I guess I think imagination is particularly human, and instinct, which we do have, but it's more blunted, it seems, in humans than it is in animals. And because they truly do have to survive on instinct. And which is also why I will trust an animal more, because if it's acting weird or if a bird falls silent or something, I know there's a real reason, as opposed to some mind game that a human is playing, and we don't know what it is. And yeah, I feel like I've drifted away from the subject of imagination, maybe because it scares me. But I'll try if you ask more.
I wanted to go back to the Greek, the Latin and Greek, too, because that is connected to imagination. Was it the Greek mythology that drew you? What was it that drew you to wanting to learn those classical stories? Oh, yeah,
well, the stories, the myths themselves, not the language.
And the language.
Yeah, because it's it's different answers, but with the mythology, I was interested in, once I understood that mythology was a human way of explaining things that weren't understood, as opposed to actually believing these things, but as ways to account for, you know, like thunder, but then it has to be gods arguing or something on Olympus. I've always been interested in how we try to explain what we don't understand, I guess, and then learning that every culture seems to have some kind of myth system, and that there's a lot of overlap between them. Like many cultures have had to explain rain, different, you know, meteorological things. So there's that. Though what really drew me to, I think the most influential part of the classics for me was learning after I studied Greek tragedy in college, and I suddenly realized that all of the tragedies have in common that there's a conflict between how someone wants to behave and how they've been told to behave. And once I understood that, I thought, oh, that's exactly where I live. First of all, I'd grown up that way, being biracial, and constantly being told I should be this way, or this is how I should talk or look, but why didn't I do those things? And then, though I didn't understand my queerness in college, but once I did understand that, I thought, well, that's another one where I had grown up being told, this is what you do. You get married to a woman and you have 2.3 children and you know, do the, whatever the thing is. And then what do you do when your body is saying that's not what you want to do? And so I recognize in people like Antigone, where she has to bury her brother if she wants to because it's her brother and she loves him. But her brother's been declared an enemy of the state, so she's a traitor if she does that. So there's no winning. So that was fascinating. That's not mythology so much as the subject matter. With the language, I think I've just always been interested in. When my father was stationed in Germany, I studied German, and that was the first time I encountered an inflected language where you can move different words around anywhere in the sentence because the word endings tell you this is the direct object, so it doesn't have to come after a verb the way it does in English. And Latin and Greek do that too. And I've always been fascinated with how that's about power then. You can choose what words do you want to put in front of the reader first? How do you want to build up suspense before you get to the end? And so that syntax allows you to manipulate power and manipulate readers' attention. And that's something I think I learned from Greek and Latin, even though I wasn't thinking that when I was learning it.
It's interesting that you tell the story about Antigone as a way of, here's an example of how the story says this is how you should behave, but then what happens when she says, well, that's not, like she wants to bury her brother even though it's inappropriate, so she's faced with that tragedy. And you could tell that story, and you could write a poem. And so the poem, I feel like in your work, the story is there, but it's so much about how it's told, and syntax being a part of that, and everything else that the poem does with the imagery and the way that it extends time and compresses it. But I think that's something I think about a lot between story and poem. Not that there needs to be a division between the two or a choice between one or the other, but what is it that a poem can do with story? What do you feel is so unique about poetry and how it can convey the story or bring it to life? Or
well, that's a hard question. I guess I think, well, first of all, I'm talking about what I think of as, I guess I'm talking mainly about lyric poetry that tends to be shorter and not have a clear beginning or clear end. And I think what, for me, poetry does, like, it tells a story by not telling it, and it relies a lot on silence and the values that silence can bring. So, I think people think of narrative, and they think of a story like beginning, middle, and end, and everything's resolved. And so people will say they're not a narrative poet because they don't write that kind of a poem. I think all poems are narrative, actually. And the poems I'm interested in writing and that I enjoy reading they rely on a psychological narrative or an emotional narrative. And to me, it's a narrative already. If a poem begins with somebody being happy and by the end they're in tears, then that's a narrative. Even though I don't have clear context for all of it. But just a shift in emotional register, to me, is story. But that's something harder to do, I think, in prose. And also, it's not what I go to prose for. I actually want the story to be told. There's something comforting. Someone once said about my poems that, and they meant it in a bad way, that the problem was that reading my poems was like always overhearing some part of a conversation between two people you're never going to meet, and you never get to know what the context was. And I actually thought, yeah, that's exactly right. I think of a lot of poems as snatches overheard, or we see a brief scene, but we don't know the full lives of everyone in the poem.
Yeah.
But that brief moment is so resonant with possibility, and the story is possible. We're enabled as readers to make stories from that because a clear storyline hasn't been laid out for us. So for me, that's what It's one way poetry is different.
It can transform.
Yeah.
Transform. One of the I've read a lot of your essays, so I really enjoy your essays.
Oh, thanks. I hate writing them.
Really?
Yeah, I hate writing
Oh
essays.
my goodness!
I
I always
hate it.
thought, oh, if only I could write an essay
I always
like Carl
kick myself
Phillips
every
writes
time I say
essays.
yes when someone asks me to,
My
which is the only way
goodness.
I'll do it. I never sit there and think, I think I'll write an essay. If someone says, we thought you would want to be in this collection, or do you want to write about this? And it's like, no, I don't, and then I fall for it every time.
Yeah.
And then I'm happy. Once I've done it, I think, oh, you're not bad, Carl, but
I'm so
but I
glad that
hate
you
it.
do, because I really enjoy your essays.
Well, but thanks.
So
Sorry to get neurotic for a moment.
One of them in the early book, Coin of the Realm, Myth and Fable, and I had like 2 questions related to that essay because I was so stuck on it for a while. But one was you were citing Joseph Campbell and talking about how each life is, this is your quote, each life is a variation of the finite number of patterns available to a life, but that if there is a limit to the number of stories, there is no limit to the number of variations to be made of those stories, as every human life is different. That to live is to fabulate. We make our story as we go through life. Essentially, we tell ourselves through. Art is what we make from a life.
Sounds good.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, wow, that's kind of, I must have had a smart moment.
Well, it reminded me of at one point in my 20s, I had some, tragic, dramatic thing, as, many things. And someone said to me, well, this is your myth-making moment. Like this story that happened to you, try to understand it through a particular myth. Find some myth that explains it for you. And that's the story of your life. That's how you can understand everything that happens. And I thought, okay, that's helpful. But then I thought, well, that's really limiting.
Yeah.
But now I have to stick with this story forever. But I'm often thinking back to that as somehow the conversation between story and poetry. That poetry has story in it, and I like that you say, like, I do believe that the narrative is always in a poem, even if it's purposely resisting narrative. It's still narrative because it's trying to change the narrative or somehow transform what it is to tell something. But then what you said about how, like, someone enters a poem, they don't know the story of the people in the poem. They don't know that privacy between the couple and their relationship.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of distilled moment that is like that essential moment of a story that is defining of the story of that poem, and maybe is defining of the story of that poet or that person reading the poem. So it allows it to be constantly varying.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is so rich that poetry can offer. Not that there's a competition at all. I love story. But, that's like the way that poetry, I think, changes stories, kaleidoscoping it.
Yeah.
But
I think so.
yeah. One of the, I guess this is kind of connected to stories, but one of the poems one of the many that I loved in the book is The Heroic Interview.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And what do you feel about that poem?
No, nothing.
No?
I'm still thinking about what you said about
Okay.
the private world that poems come from.
Yeah.
And how poems become a kind of mythologized version of that, which I find interesting. And then I was thinking, too, about what Zach was saying in the introduction about privacy. And yeah, because one of the things I never count on, I forget, to me, poems are made in complete privacy, and they're about very private, intimate things for me. And then it's weird to be on a stage reading them or see people read them in a book, and stranger but gratifying when people say, oh, it resonated with me. I related in this way or that way, and which will be in a way that's not at all what it came from initially, but it's a valid way to read the poem and enter it. And so I've always wondered, what is that thing, that we make from very private things, and then it manages to be something more than that, which is kind of like a trick, but I don't know what the trick is. Like how, like Ellen Bryant Voigt talks about how lyric poetry is not about it's not about the transcription of experience, but the transformation of it. And I agree with that, but that's it's not an easy thing to say, but it's one thing to say it, but how do you transform it, you know? So I always feel like I'm just sitting here with my ordinary life. And as I said to the Michener students yesterday, when people say, well, what are your books about? I think they're just the further adventures of Carl. But somehow, you know, then some deer is not a deer anymore, even though it's just a deer in my backyard. But suddenly it's a stag of nobility or something. And, you know, everything becomes mythical. And I don't know how that happens.
I don't either. I wonder, sometimes I think the trick is in language. And the fact also that, you know, as poets too, we use language as to kind of convey that imagination instead of dancing or, you know. But we also know that, you know, when I tell you the story of my dream last night, it's not at all going to be the dream. There's no way that I can translate that. And the language, I always feel like, just destroys it. In the same way that I can understand an experience by overlaying a myth to it and say, well, this is kind of like this thing. But I also know that that's still a translation because that experience is so multidimensional. And then memory, too. That we're putting language to the memory, knowing that the minute something is remembered, we've altered it and almost enters into kind of the neural system, so that the next time we remember it, we remember our memory of the memory, and then it alters it again. So it's getting further and further away, or maybe closer and closer, but we'll never know because we don't know what the original is. And so it feels like language is constantly this trick, you know, upon us, but hence why I think there's so much satisfaction in manipulating like the parts of language, knowing what you're doing with the syntax and being able to follow, you know, if you moved this predicate here, how much that could change the entire poem and transform it so that the thing that you started writing about is not what someone else is going to end up with, that it's inevitably going to transform outside of your making. Which seems like...
Seems very deep.
To be a maker of something and to know that the thing you're making is not ever going to be the
well,
anything
I guess
that you can
maybe that's why I never think about
remake.
It. Like you go kind of well, because it'd be hard to be so self-conscious of something like that. You know, sort of. And also memory. I feel like it took me much longer than it should have to realize memory is not trustworthy. I thought that memory was the only way you could hold on to the truth. And then to realize, well, just because you remember something a certain way doesn't mean that was accurate. If you ask someone else who was there at the scene, and and recently I've started thinking about the weird power you have with memory when the other people who were there on the scene are no longer alive. And then you realize, oh, I wrote somewhere about this night where I said, as I understand it, it's up to me now to decide what exactly happened. And it's a weird power to sort of say, well, this is how it happened. That's why I also think memoir is shifty. Because one person is saying this is how it went about and everything, but that's just their memory of it. And is it true? But it's true that that's how they experience it in their minds. All right, I'm getting dizzy, so I'm going to stop talking.
Speaking of truth, well, could I ask you to read Heroic Interval? I tell you, it all comes down to this. It all makes sense in a minute. It will. Okay.
I'm going to read it.
Oh, okay, you have.
What, is that what you want me to do?
Yes, please.
We really hang out all the time, can you tell? We do. Well, we don't really, but I feel as if we do. Where is it?
It's on page 26.
Oh, thanks. I have a thing with no table content. Oh, okay. I thought it was a different poem.
This is a longer one.
I know, it's fine. Okay, it's called Heroic Interval. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, because I have this thing on. Up from the bottom of wherever in the mind things go to be forgotten, most of them forever, he reappears at the edge of that meadow inside me I've spent most of my life trying to convince others isn't made up at all, but real, as he is. Above him, a bewilderment of black swans pulling their bodies across a band of nightfall, though it can't be night, for the meadow's not dark yet. It keeps flashing like a basin of water set down in sunlight. As he walks towards me, It almost looks like the routine gesture with interruptions that I used to think love more or less came down to, before I figured out I could stop. I could always have stopped, and should maybe try to. Closer now. He parts the grasses, breast high, in front of him. His arms like blades meant for winnowing intimacy from tenderness, or nostalgia from truth. Nothing's changed. Still the kind of man who sees no reason to take his gloves off, assassin gloves, during sex. Still what feels like a dream at first. That moment in dream when a friend you've learned not to trust entirely turns to tell you, half threatening it, half consolation, the only dream is this one. But it isn't a dream. I can tell. He'd be taking his gloves off. He'd be raising his soft hands to his face. Scorched map, busted compass. He'd have a face. Kind of creepy.
I think that's why I was struck by the poem.
The assassin gloves came to me while walking my dog.
Oh, did it?
Yeah.
How so?
I was just walking along, and I was wearing these gloves, and I thought, these look like the kind of gloves like assassins wear, you know, like really tight black leather gloves. And then I thought, assassin gloves, somebody, and then I suddenly had this idea of someone who only wore gloves during sex, and these kinds of gloves.
I love that
And then I
part.
scampered home. I thought, I think I better write that down.
Well, I did feel this was such a, I mean, a lot of the poems in this book I found were haunting. But to me, I enjoy things that are haunting because it's about the interval, the liminal space where we think we know what we're talking about. We think we know the memory, and then we realize we don't really know the memory, that the memory escapes us. There's that line where you talk about the memory is the dead. That there's a ghostliness to that, which to the truth. And something about this poem that just struck me so much was thinking about how this kind of heroic figure, which feels like it comes from a myth and possibly either a public or a private, and I think all myths are both, public, private, cultural, and some combination of all, that it kind of comes out of your dream space or from walking a dog. And it finds its way into a poem, and it's almost as if the poem, and since you can't see it on the page, but like the syntax and the way there's these dropped lines and the asterisks through the poem are helping to somehow navigate this movement between the real and the imagined, that liminality. And you know, and really towards this question of like, if he had a face, you know, what is it to see your face? Is some reflection of yourself in this other story, and being separate from it, and yet listening for it because it's going to tell you something of the truth. And I'm trying to think of where I was going with that, but I was struck. So you read "Like So," and then in that poem,
which has a basin of water.
Which has the basin of water, and I loved seeing those two images come together. This is the poem where it's like a solar eclipse. I could see my. Do you mind if I read that line?
No.
Okay. I could see my face tilted there like a solar eclipse viewed indirectly, which is the proper way in a basin of water. You must hold it steady, keep the basin safe from the wind's reach, its competing powers of revelation and distortion. So that poem then being kind of echoed with this basin of water in this other poem that brings back the question of revelation and distortion. I wanted to ask you about revelation and distortion.
I'm scared already.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's almost like, in the poem with the fall colors, where there's kind of this distortion that comes through the shadow after a kind of revelation that is kind of known but unknown, something that's considered, like, oh, maybe that is so, my friend told me that. And then it leads to a kind of a revelation through a distortion, in a way. I wanted to ask you about that two-line. It's competing powers of revelation and distortion, and how do you feel them to be competing?
Well, I think, I don't know, I was going to say that's how my life is, but it feels like, I guess I feel that that's maybe an aim of poetry, for me anyway, is to reach clarity about something temporary clarity, because it's usually wrestling with things that can never be clear, like the erotic or betrayal or violence or whatever. But how to come to some brief amount of clarity and peace with something. But I find that it's so hard to know, am I seeing something clearly? Am I seeing something for the first time and this is a new way of seeing? Or is it a distortion, which is a new way of seeing, but it's not accurate? But distortion and revelation can both, they can seem the same thing for a moment. And it's hard to know, has something been revealed to me, or it is revealed, but in some way that I'm not even seeing clearly what I think I'm seeing. It seems very heady, and I'm not a very heady person, but that's... the problem for me is that I'll be writing about something simple like how wind can blow in the water of a basin.
Yeah. And
it does seem like, okay, something could be revealed or distorted, but I'll just throw out words like that, revelation, distortion, think, that seems right, that's the end of the poem. And I'm fine until someone asks me, what's your relationship to revelation and distortion? I don't know. I don't know. This is why sometimes I think, I'm always scared when they say, we're going to ask you to talk about your poems.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, why? I should just read
the
them
poem.
and run out of the room.
Just read the poem.
But,
No.
Because I feel like my answers are always going to be, then people will be disappointed, like, oh, it's just that, like
Well,
he doesn't even know.
I am really glad you don't have an answer.
But what I will say about the basin of water, I just want
Yeah.
to say, because I know there are several of the Michener students who are working on the thesis right now, and we were talking about revision, and when I was going through these poems, I was very bothered when I saw that Basin of Water was in 2 poems. That seems a lot of basins for one very short book. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to move these around. And then I started finding more things that were echoed around. And I thought, is this whole book redundant? And so then I moved things around. And then, sure enough, the editor, when I turned it into him, he said, oh, you've done this really interesting echo chamber of things, and it's all about, and he said, I see the revelation and distortion that you're doing. And I just nodded like, that's it. But it was really a way, so it just shows it could be redundant, but you can, maybe with arrangement sometimes, it can make a real difference. And then it becomes purposeful.
That's part of the trick.
So, yeah.
That's part of the trick. No, I did feel, I mean, as a reader, I was finding all that with, again, it's just the hauntingness of memory.
Yeah.
And that at a certain point, I guess we're all, wherever we are in one's life, we're looking back sometimes.
Yeah.
And thinking about how things have transformed to where we are, and should we understand something about that? Should we find meaning in that? Should we, or how much do we just kind of acknowledge and walk forward into that next space? And maybe that's kind of the poet being in between, maybe getting lost, right? And trying to find one's way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yes. And I think these repetitions are, I mean, they happen to all of us. And yeah, this is a slight tangent, but somewhat related. The thing is, I didn't actually think of this book originally as a book. I thought it was, after my last book, I decided I was never going to write a book of poems again. I was only going to write chapbooks, because I think those are much cooler, and I like the brevity of them. And so I saw this actually as 3 little chapbooks, and then various people told me that my idea was stupid, and that they said, you're writing a book, you're not going to do chapbooks. I don't know. No one takes me seriously. So, so I thought, well, but I'm going to stitch them together. So in my mind, it's 3 sections, but that's why they all have titles as opposed to, usually I would number them or something. And it was a last-minute decision to whip the titles around. It used to be that each section was titled with the poem that ended that section. And then the last minute, I decided to have no title section match where the poem could be found as a way of stitching them. So it ties in, I guess this is how it's relevant, this idea of memory. Because I thought, okay, that will reinforce this idea that if people say, oh, I think I heard that somewhere else, that it's purposeful, but that's how memory works. That we remember the same thing in a different context, so it does recur, but it's different in that context.
So it's all, do you feel, well, you've talked about your other books and other processes of writing. I've heard in interviews where you've said that you don't think about making a book.
No.
You think about, here's the 40 poems that I like the best that I've written, and it's time to put them together.
Yeah.
And so in this case, you feel like it kind of surprised you?
Yeah, because I was just thinking, well, these poems all seem to go together in these poems. And then, but yeah, then I was surprised that, these echoes can be a tool in some way.
But you almost had to get lost in order to find them?
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't know you did a cooking show. That's how much I'm not on social media. Oh, we have, how much time do we have left? We're done.
Like, we're done.
Oh my God.
Don't talk about a cooking show. See?
Okay.
Thank you, Grace.
Yes. Thank you. That's all to say that we should all get some food, but also find his cooking show. I'm not a social media person, and your student, Jenny Johnson, the great poet, said, I'm talking with Carl Phillips, and I'm so nervous, I don't know what to say. She said, just ask him about cooking. And it took this whole time to actually get me to that question.
Well, maybe in retirement I might revive the cooking show.
Okay,
so,
good.
We'll see. Thank you for all of this. Thank you.